have people continue to trickle in. Usually
Yeah.
about 5 minutes after is where most of those who will come will come. For those of you who have been here before, thanks for coming again. For those of you who haven't, the way this typically goes is Dan and I will have a conversation about whatever's interesting to him. If you don't find it interesting, feel free to log off. That's fine. Then usually somewhere around halfway through, we'll open things up for question and answer. So as you go along, Shelby says, don't log off. It's a good conversation, right? It's your loss if you leave. But as as it goes along, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat. If you want to put up a hand later on, so usually we'll let people unmute themselves, usually about that halfway point. Please do stay muted throughout, though, otherwise it gets kind of distracting when things pop and go. But feel free to use the chat as a placeholder for thoughts as we tend to go along. With that said, thanks for coming, Dan.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite. It's always, I always enjoy these opportunities, and then actually, having an audience and having people tuned into the conversation, I actually think adds a really cool element to it, like, which is something that gets lost between, sometimes if it's just between a couple of nerds, so.
Yeah, exactly. So Shelby Miller was sort of one of the key impetuses behind this, and her thing was she wanted to do our best to recreate the whole idea of after the conference when you're sitting around with a group of people having a conversation. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the idea behind all of this. But I was actually thinking earlier, I was like, when did I actually meet you? And I don't remember the official, but I do remember the first thing that stands out, which was I was up in New York, and I think this was 2012 or 2013. Patrick was doing his course at that closed course at Drive 495, and I had live tweeted as it went through, and you wrote, I think it was a blog post based off of the tweets.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And Patrick, well, what stood out was Patrick's comment on that was, this is awesome, because you took exactly what he was trying to get across from a scattering of tweets from, him talking all day long, whatever I got out. And that's when I was like, oh yeah, that's, I think maybe strengthcoach.com or something is where we first met. But what's keeping you excited currently? Like what's interesting and new for you?
I guess
or
it's
old and interesting.
Some of it's, it's got, I always think of duality, like it's got the elements where some of the relationships that I've formed, including with Patrick, go back so long and so far that like now it's comical to me to think about, just how deeply rooted some of these relationships are. Nate Brookerson is another person he's with the Seattle Kraken now, and him and I go way back. We on Patrick's invite, we're at Nike's like 2010, like it was like some sort of world summit deal thing, and Nate and I were roommates, and so now it's just like, coming up through things together. But then also like you start to get this idea, especially like with the force plates thing, where you're getting really close to like this like deeper understanding, and it still feels like it's just a little bit out of reach, and so you just keep on pursuing it. And then some of the stuff you end up being like, yeah, it wasn't all that I thought it was going to be, like, which is very much where I am with force plates. But at the same time, you're like, but man, that's a pretty big piece of the puzzle. It's
yeah, it's one of those things that I think one of the most frustrating parts of going through life is realizing how many of the trite sayings that are really annoying to hear are actually rooted in a ton of truth.
Yeah.
It's like, damn it, why did it have to be that accurate, right? There's because it's just irritating. And one, the whole Bruce Lee thing about when I started, a punch was a punch, a kick was a kick. And then as I studied, it no longer was. And then as I achieved mastery, a punch was a punch and a kick was a kick again. And I think of that a lot because people will say, well, it's just XYZ. I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's true. But the amount of understanding to be able to understand what that means when you say it takes a lot of time and effort and mistakes. And like you were talking about, all these people that you bump into and rub elbows with. I said, like, Don's on here. He and I went to undergrad together. So a lot of, like you said, a long history of
Mhm.
arguing and digging into things and getting feedback. Nate Berkerson, actually, I met him when I met Mark McLaughlin at
Laughlin.
the, yeah,
That's
at
right.
the,
Mark was like shutting down his gym that weekend. That was like actually I felt gosh, I felt like crying with the guy, like it was like that was his baby.
yeah. So we met at the first, was it Central Virginia
Okay.
conference, the inaugural one. And that was, we were all still in the time of having five people in a hotel room sharing costs to make things go over. But yeah, just like as I was reflecting on it and started thinking of that whole idea of the time that it takes to get to the point where you can say it's just one thing or another. So you mentioned force plates. I know we've had some conversations early back when I first started using them,
Mhm.
and you were the only force X guy in the game, I think, at that point, right?
That's right.
And I'd be interested to hear, like, where are you at now with them? Like, what's your thoughts on?
Yeah, it's it's interesting. I mean, the same duality thing, you're going to find that I relate really well to that. But um, it started out where, if I just give a little bit of, I guess, backstory to like how I ended up being like the fourth place guy in the US, is that I was finishing my master's with Edith Cowan, which is an Australian program that's largely distance, but you have like an in-person piece to it. So I was just finishing that out, and I was purchasing the software. Like I had found out about it. I forget how, just kind of because I'm a nerd. I had found out about their success in the US and with the English Institute of Sport. And so I reached out before they were coming over, right?
Hmm.
And then they were like, "Hey, we're coming to the US." Like, and so I arranged to meet Dr. Cohen. I drove up to Houston and connected with him, and then I bought the software and started, getting into things with Pascos, which I still have that set of Pascos.
They
Uh,
last forever.
one of the best investments I've ever made. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Um, they ended up, when I started working for them, they gave me my money back, which was really, upstanding of
Hmm.
them. But I started working with them, and then I started talking about what I was doing. And I know you and I have shared communications on the matter where I've said, like I brought coaching strategy into force plates, like what I was trying to do, and then seeing how that affected force platforms. And of course, there's like a historical connection to that with like the scientific literature, like that goes way back, like to Bosco's stuff. Um, but the thing that really struck me was that, okay, there was a lot of validity to this approach and to like some of the hardware element of force plates, like, like certain things, it's like literally you check that box or you don't, and if you don't, then like there's some sort of performance problem associated. It's not a problem for everybody, but it's like it just comes down to what your results are. So I started bringing that into discussions, and then Dr. Cohen was like, "Hey, would you mind talking to this team about what you just told me?" And then I did my first presentation for them, and it just like, we did this call with like, there was I think the New Zealand Hurricanes, Saracens rugby, like it was like, a lot of international clients, and they all just like overwhelmed him with feedback of being like, "This is awesome," like this is exact, because I talked some of the CMJ stuff, which has always been like my main deal. And because I had worked with a lot of volleyball and a lot of jumpers, track and field, etc., like that had become a thing for me. um, I had a lot to share on like what the force time, the trace itself, like what we could do by just looking at like the pattern that's in place there, and then how that relates to, isometric characteristics of a more global or specific fashion, and then how that relates to, drop jump characteristics to the 10-5 repeat jump test, things like that. And I think it was just very well timed, like I think that's kind of the
Hmm.
whole, it's the outliers thing, right? Like that's why the Beatles are the Beatles and all those things like that. I give myself credit for stepping away because it was the right thing for my family. That I took a full-time role at Trinity University, which it's a school I had a lot of history with, and I had my kids were, I guess, probably 5 and 6 at the time. So it was like me flying all over the country, doing big time stuff was great. But if I'm not kissing my kids, you know, and send them to bed every night, I don't know if I feel good about any of that. So
Right.
I still do a little bit of consulting, but it's pretty spotty at this point. It just depends on people who will hear me on something like this, and then I'll reach out and say, "Hey, I'd be interested in getting some work with you done," and then things go from there.
That's yeah, like you said, it's a long circle, and I think a lot of times with those things, somebody's going to fill that position, and that's where they talk about preparation and luck is where things go. But so like with that history now coming back around, when you're looking at the force plates
Yep.
currently, how much of a loss in your programming would there be if you had them removed?
Ooh, good question. I would say, um, if I'm being honest, probably not too much, like from because there is some stuff where we overfit like what we see on a performance test, like again, one of the things that I jumped on early on was like guys in the Premier League don't train. Like that's historical, like that's knowledge. So it's like the idea that their readiness is high is, because of, this metric or this. I'm like, you've got a group of them jumping 30 centimeters, and I've consistently put, like female high school, female collegiate, and not Division 1 collegiate, but Division 3, like in the mid 40s to 50s. So I'm like if you're doing a 30 centimeter jump as a professional athlete, like I'm not impressed with that at all, at all. And then you look at the approach of it, and a lot of that is like, okay, well, that's hands on hips. And it's like, oh, okay, well, are they good at jumping with their arms? Because I would suggest to you, and having coached a lot of people, that they have no idea how to use their arms when they're jumping, that's the
Yeah.
likelihood. Um, and so being able to take some of those pieces apart, and you can do that like with force plates. You can look at what their arm contribution is to the jump compared to what it isn't. But I don't think enough people have enough of that coaching strategy linked to it. And I always say it has to come back to the technical model. And if you don't have
Hmm.
a technical model in place, then you can find yourself pretty hamstrung, because you'll look at one athlete who's like, oh, wow, they jumped. That was a 40. That was pretty good. Like I haven't really touched them, and they're really explosive. It's like, okay, but where do you go from here? Like I always try to get people to be sensitive to being like, what are you going to do on their next jump? You'd be like, all right, now I want you to really try hard, jump as high as you can. It's like that's no longer useful advice, is to say jump as explosively as you can. It's like that box has been checked, and you have to figure out where to look. And there's certain numbers and relationships. One of the things that I go back to a lot is like the 3 times body weight in the eccentric phase of a counter movement jump, right? Like that's a pretty big box for us to check, and it's not absolutely critical, but most good jumpers will hit that at a minimum threshold. And one of the things that stood out to me, one of our female athletes, our volleyball players, had she tripled her body weight on that. And I was like, when we looked at our baseball team, we are like, on their hex bar deadlift, you got guys 2.5, some of them maybe even 3 times their body weight. I'm like, but can you triple your body weight in less than a half a millisecond, in a more dynamic task, right? And none of them could do it. Like it was like they really kind of were like, they're a blunt instrument, right? Which is
Yeah.
I hope there's no big baseball people on here, but that's
That's right. You can make fun of any sport. We
right.
treat them all equally. No, that's fast. So I guess a couple questions to dig in on that for me would be, when you say triple body weight, you're taking any point in the eccentric and braking or eccentric deceleration, whatever. We'll use the force X terminology here, but be aware that other
Yep.
places use
Yep.
different terminology for this. But basically, what we're looking at is and correct me if I'm wrong, but during the deceleration, during the drop, we're going to have the highest forces, and it's usually somewhere right before zero velocity.
Yep.
And so you're just taking that peak force and then pairing it to body weight. Is
Yeah,
that
so we'll
correct?
and we'll look at that relationship in newtons, and that's the tricky
Yes.
thing that you have to do independent of the software, which I've gotten to evolve. And because I have good relationships there, I'm like rubbing their face in that all the time. I'm like, you need to put it, because it's just so much easier, and especially it's how we relate relative strength as strength and conditioning professionals is like, what's the relationship to body weight, right? Like that's a pretty easy piece to communicate to. But if I'm doing it, in newtons, it's like if you're talking about newtons with student athletes, it's like you're already like they're like, I don't want to be in physics class, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it just doesn't relate as well. But that's exactly what I'm saying. And so I'm glad you brought up the terminology thing, because I actually love how Hawkins communicates about the breaking phase, because that's actually one of the things that I talk about on the coaching strategy is like, okay, if we produce that big eccentric, what's the mechanism, right? Because if we're talking about a counter movement jump and you're limited to body mass and the relationship is force equals mass times acceleration, what is your eccentric mechanism to create big forces that you know are necessary for a big jump? It's like, well, it's acceleration. Well, where's that acceleration come from if you have a negative force relationship? And that's where, I don't, there's some people who have said this and they'll call it a passive lengthening, which I disagree with. I think it's actually quite active. I relate it to, I've got this great video I show of this little female skateboarder. I'm happy and she's in a little tutu and she's dropping in on her skateboard into one of those empty swimming pools. And I just love
Mm.
the visual. Cause like, if you've ever thought about trying something like that, I've never thought about it except for just being like, wow, that's really cool. They can do that. It's like, requires such community. You're either all there or you're going to fall flat on your face. And to me, like that's how we teach jump performance. One of the first things that I learned to really help people stand out is I'll have people stand in their jump position. I don't know if everybody can see my camera. Have them put their arms in front of them like they're about to, use some arm swing to create a down motion in their vertical jump. And I'll push against them as hard as I can. And then I let them go and they just drop into it like that. And I'm like, that's closer to what we're looking for in that eccentric phase, right? You can't max it
Hmm.
out because anything that you do, like I always tell people, the best jump performance is going to be the most harmonious. It's not going to be the one that had the biggest this or this or this. Of course, there are certain like the velocity metrics. The biggest jumps are the highest velocity. But
Right.
in terms of the causal relationship going to the eccentric phase, if you put out a huge eccentric peak force, that's probably not going to get you there because you're going to spend more. There's going to be more entropy, right? Like you're going to lose energy from all of the hard braking, but you need to be at a high percentage of that. You need to be fast and hard down. But does that make sense?
Absolutely. You're basically surfing your limits across all domains because if you go too far, you dump it. Right.
Yep.
So, like you said, if you attack really hard, one of the things I'll see is like giving some feedback on people to attack the ground, and you'll just see them pull their feet up off the ground.
Yep.
They think that that's right. So, and then you get that double little stutter in it. And so it's
Uh-huh.
like you said, a lot of coordination aspect of this is not what you can maximally do in this one off component.
Yep.
It's can you keep it red line throughout? And you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to surf that limit of your ability throughout. And as that gets orchestrated, it's a huge motor skill component.
Absolutely.
You've, which, goes to some of the carryover of training. And that's probably a good thing to bring in here. So when you're looking at your strength training compared to this,
Mm-hmm.
are you like, what are your thoughts on, everybody, how strong is too strong, all that sort of stuff. So we're talking about this from a capacity perspective,
Mm-hmm.
but also a motor skill perspective. And so that task specific to the counter movement jump. Just briefly, sort of interested in your thoughts on that component.
Yeah, like it's one of the more interesting metrics that people relate again and they'll say, oh, this really stands out in good jumpers or good athletes. It's like the force at zero velocity characteristic, right? And what's interesting about force at zero velocity is that's the bottom position, right? Which is, we know, the most exposed position. Like when the athlete has gone the hardest, assuming you got maximum intent, and they're the weakest, that becomes a very specific, what's it called? Gosh, I haven't used that term in so long, the amortization phase, right? Like
Yes. Yes.
it's like the thing that nobody can really identify. Oh, okay, well, where's the amortization phase? It's like, well, it's like it dissolves across all of these characteristics, right?
It's
But
calculus.
right, but if we're But if we were to say, okay, force at zero velocity, and we have this like point where you're overexposed, well, that's a big part of what we're doing from the coaching strategy and on the training side is trying to get into that. And that's where technology like flywheels, like accentuated eccentrics, things like that can just get people to have uh, maybe a little bit more availability in how we approach that, that they can figure out how to spend more time in those positions. You can do it with like, far more subtle approaches, like, but that's what I think is a hallmark. Like you said, I like the idea of surfing the peaks. And that was pretty much one of my first visuals was like, okay, well, what's the first peak? Well, it's actually a little slight velocity peak. Then there's an eccentric power peak. Then it's the eccentric force peak. And then in the concentric phase, things go haywire, right? Because technically, like again, the try hard thing, like when you're trying to jump really high, you just like flexing as much as you can. And no, it's not a high force characteristic. So in the propulsive phase, in the concentric phase, the analogy, this was a friend of mine with Vald, Kareem Durakwai. He said we were discussing the characteristics of it. He said, yeah, it's like trying to pedal downhill. Like your speed is going higher and you're trying to stay on the gas pedal. And we see that especially in bimodal jumpers, which is when you have what's called a double peak. In bimodal jumpers, I always say that second peak is the one where there's the potential to have high forces at high velocity, which is not an easy trick, right? In the concentric, sorry if I'm using those terms, repetitively, but in the propulsive phase, it's not an easy thing to do because the likelihood is, and that's what like another term that I use that has no basis in the scientific literature, but it's just like subjectively what I'll call it the float characteristic. So if you've ever seen somebody do a counter movement jump test or any jump test, and it doesn't look like they had any sort of snap to the movement, right? And they just kind of like, maybe they didn't even fully extend their hips, their shoulders kind of stayed down. And you'll get people where you'll see this very like regressed kind of overall motion. And you're like, wow, that looked really, really kind of simple to do. Like it didn't really have any edge to it at all, but you actually see that a lot, especially with the hands on hips when you're first introducing that. So I had taken to using Bruce Lee, and the language that I've used that I've always told people the counter movement jump is the 1-inch punch of sports science testing, because it's learning how to do more with less. And then eventually you should be able to do more, right? You should be able to like, okay, if I add arms to it, like I should be able to create a bigger change because that's going to add velocity. Anyway, it's so that it's going to all trickle down from that first. If you can be truly savage with your hands on your hips, then I know that we can add on to that really easily. Where when we take it backwards a step and someone just, like I did a testing with Charlie Weingroff at with Canada's men's basketball program. And that was exactly what we saw. It was like a lot of the guys like, never even fully extended their hips. Right. And I'm like, when you think about where the takeoff velocity point is, like that's the point where you've got to be going as fast as possible. And if you eased up before you even hit that point, then, it really does. It's that's probably on the velocity side, just as important on the propulsive phase as all the eccentric stuff we're talking about is putting those characteristics to make that action truly ballistic.
Yeah, because impulse comes from pushing longer. So the longer, like you're basically robbing yourself of the ability to put more impulse into that propulsion going up. And this is a huge component for me where, I think similarly with, well, I guess when I first started using force plates, it was serial testing in a team setting. So I got to experiment with that, and you just really see how long it takes people to actually get a good test. And that was then going back and trying to do one-off tests for people who come in and, hey, we want to get a jump tested. It's kind of a waste in a lot of times because a test kind of has to be maximal for it to be anchored. Like if it's not maximal, it's not really anchored. And the only sub-maximal tests that tend to work is energy system type stuff where we're looking at a proxy measure like heart rate at this thing. counter movement jump, when we're looking at forces, unless you know the max, you don't really know much at all.
Right.
And I started just stripping different things out. Um, because I was like, well, nobody does the squat jump right the first time, and
Right.
usually takes forever to do that. So, all right, I'm not going to do the squat jump.
Right.
Counter movement jump, we can get there, but it takes longer. And if I only have one time, I'll look at it. But I'm just looking for the big punch me in the face differences
Right.
as
Right.
opposed to anything else. Um, I'd be interested, sort of going back. Well, one thing that you mentioned, like the isokinetic, or I'm sorry, the K box.
Mhm.
I think that's a really, because more and more you're seeing people with the flywheel type devices, and similar to what you're discussing with how much work you do to be savage with the eccentric component. I think a lot of times there's this sort of belief that if you have the piece of equipment, it comes with the validity, reliability attached, like you sprinkle that on and then it works. So, well, you have a flywheel, therefore it's eccentric overload. It's like, no, it's
Right.
the force you put into that is as much as
Right.
you're getting back. Same idea. So I'd be interested when you're thinking of this, and I think your concept of having that fundamental foundational thing that you're coaching to. So it's not I do this exercise. It's these are the things that I care about. So when you're looking at making jumps better and you're coaching the lift to improve that, are
Mhm.
there some particular things that you're looking at in the lift that you're looking for that carryover, or are you just overloading the system so it's forced to respond?
Good question. Goodness, this is going to take some real consideration. I'll give you a hard pause here.
Good.
I would link I've had this can never go wrong with a good Dan, but Dan Paff is like one of my
Mm-hmm.
mentors. And I go back to in his system, right? Like, the Alta system, if you will, like is an extension of Dan Paff's philosophy. He's like pretty much the head honcho going back through history on that. But
Right.
like relating the rudiment series, right? And then how they relate to acceleration characteristics, and then how they're going to train max velocity characteristics, and then what their strength power schemes look like, right? I almost always go back to the microcycle, in terms of how I'm structuring things. And a lot of the way that I structure that's different, and that I actually moved away from when I moved into my role at Trinity. I went with like a very conservative strength conditioning model, like let's get a bunch of work done, get our tonnage up, and it was very average, like it just didn't, it was exactly what I thought, which is that when we looked for the edge that I'm talking about on the performance side of things, non-existent. It was like, because of course it wasn't, and some of these objective numbers that I had seen in my work, where I had coached a little bit more truer to my personal philosophy, that I had seen that, wow, we could actually be really impactful, like really fast on some of these characteristics. And then given time for the real adaptation to go into place, I always say it's like, it's getting better before you get higher. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
if you can see better happening, then higher is going to come, but there were times where we were counting on our squat max being up in order to drive our vertical jump up, even if it was a subtle drive up. And I would see that people just, yeah, there was very poor translation. So it just told me that, like, if something's important, again, what you'll see in the Alta system is that then you need to be training it year round. Exactly what volumes and intensities are you training it year round? Like that's the part that you're going to have to really work hard to create a fluid, harmonious system with. Does that feel like I'm getting
Yeah.
to what
There's
you're,
there's there's no wrong answer. I'm just like those are the things that I think of. Is it's fun to have these discussions about things, and then you go back and you're like, wait, how do am I gonna actually
right?
do this, right? So it's that's where I'm interested in going back to that basic principle of, if you don't have that foundation that you're coaching from,
Yep.
then all you're doing is throwing random things in the pot and hoping that what comes out the other end works
Yeah.
how you want it to.
Yeah, well, that's
Um,
one of the things that we see is that, and one of the things that I played with a lot, right, early was like the strategic differences. Okay, I'm going to try to jump this way. I'm going to just bury it and then jump from deeper knee angles, right? And then I'm just going to go as fast as I can. And then we'll try to do something that's kind of in between, kind of like a Goldilocks approach, right? And that's that basically, in a nutshell, like, let's say it's not rocket science, but that's pretty much ends up being very close to how the sequence actually goes. It's like we start out by like looking at these deeper angles and making sure someone has like a high degree of competency there, right? Making sure that they understand. One of the big things that I might get sidetracked on this, but one of the big things in the plyometric piece that people have to understand on the motor skill side is the delay of ground contact to produce stiffness later. Okay. And that can be, it can be at, the higher knee angles, classic to like pogo jumps and repeat jump tests. And it can also be at depth jumps, right? Like I always say, like if you imagine Kobe Bryant changing direction on a basketball court, right? Like how low they get when you look at how they're producing bigger stopping forces. And then, like P3 has a lot of this data, which is a little bit overwhelming for people like on the mocap and force plate side of
mhm.
things. But you'll see these guys who are called these like, oh, this guy's an awesome decelerator. You're like, yeah, James Harden's not a great jumper, but he's like 98% in eccentric deceleration characteristics. And that's where some of those spikes, like they're not telling you the whole story, right? Because I would say that, yes, on the performance side, I don't feel good about his training as an athlete, for lots of reasons. But specific to what he does and how he gets paid, like, who am I? Like, what who am I to say that like he's not optimizing vertical jump performance? It's
Right. And like you mentioned earlier, like a lot of the elite athletes are not, they're not the most athletic. They're just very good at their sport. And so I think Rob Panarello will always put up the two videos of guys doing box jumps side by side. And one of them is incredible and the other one's okay, but you're like,
yep,
I could hang with that dude. And the second one is I forget what it is. I think a baseball pitcher, starting, and the other guy couldn't make it through Division II college.
yep,
And that was just, he's a great athlete, terrible baseball player.
yep.
So I want to go back though, because I think what you said was about that idea of delaying contact in the
Mhm.
plyometrics. Can you describe that? Let's say you're doing a uh, linear deceleration, right? So
Yep.
you're running forward and you're doing, how are you coaching that for the athlete?
So one of the things that I was fortunate to have the exposure that I did was with Philip Graham Smith, who's he's the co-founder of ForceDex and he's the biomechanist on the team, right? Dr. Cohen is a
Mm-hmm.
sports scientist, some background in biomechanics. He was Dr. Philip Graham Smith's student actually, and then they worked
Yeah.
on the ForceDex piece together, and then all the links to the EIS. But he's been more quiet, kind of the silent partner for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually got to go to the CSCCA, the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association event with that guy. And you want to talk about, a little bit of a polarizing kind of interaction, like take a guy
Oh
from
yeah.
from Liverpool like into a group of collegiate strength coaches at the CSCCA, and it was something to watch. But so
That's awesome.
he had tremendous data on jumpers because he works at, I think it's either Aspetar or Aspire. Which one is the one in Qatar?
I think they're across the road from each other, if I remember
Right,
correctly, but I
right.
might be
So it's
wrong.
it's it's he's in one of those, and has worked with a lot of great jumpers and sprint athletes. And of course, in track and field, the term penultimate step is very central to the technical model, right? But that's pretty much what we're talking about, is that step that, okay, you spent, like on the long jump, you spent however many meters going faster horizontal. Now you need to convert it to vertical. How are you going to do that? Well, you've got to create some braking force to be able to transition into that vertical propulsive phase while not losing velocity. And so in one of the big ways that you'll be able to do that is by having a good penultimate step. When we're talking about change of direction, most pre-planned change of direction with the penultimate step, that's going to be actually from an intent standpoint, like where you're looking for. It basically turns almost every cut into an inside leg cut. Like if they're changing direction, it's an inside leg cut. If they're not, and they're going forward with the intent of transitioning to vertical, they're not changing direction, but they're still using that to provide the stiffness necessary to be
Mm-hmm.
on the brakes as late as possible, right? While maintaining high speed that they can reaccelerate, into the vertical jump.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's still, that's a change of direction. It's just vertically. And you have gravity.
Absolutely.
You're fighting gravity, which is that's why it's so much harder, right? Yeah.
Yes.
That's one of the things that I'll often bring up is the difference between landing with a flexed knee and landing while flexing your knee. They're two, very different. One, you're dissipating force over a much larger range of motion, which means that your peak loads are lower because total impulse will be the same if your entry and exit velocity are the same.
Yep.
But you can either, like when people think flex knee, and that's something we'll talk about a lot in a rehab setting from ACL or what have you perspective. And there's this thought, okay, that means we need to have the knee bending. Well, you could do that, but that's a really inefficient method, and you're going to get beat every time.
Yep.
So the goal is, right, more so that land with the knee flex. But like you're saying, when you see these athletes do that, someone cutting or you watch someone like a running back who does a good job.
Mm-hmm.
They're staying low and they're just back and forth. They are really, really low. That it's more so in the unanticipated place where you'll see that extended leg because all of a sudden the time parameter got robbed from you and you have to change direction now. And so the reason why you extend the leg is because it takes less time, right? So you're able to put force in the ground earlier and come out. So
Yep.
Is that something you ever coach as far as like when we're talking about that stiffness and delaying? Are you using any sort of coaching to get them to land in that deeper flexion perspective, or is that something you allow to emerge? How do you find that?
Yeah, it's basically like I pretty much bucket landings into deceleration landings and impact landings. So where an impact landing is more of the stiffness characteristic, and a deceleration should be more of the compliance characteristic, right? But again, with the delayed ground contact piece, you could actually be very stiff because when you look at the metrics, like one of my early jobs with ForceDex was to provide plain English definitions for all of like the scientific terminology, so that American strength coaches, particularly football American strength coaches,
Yep.
would be able to grasp the terminology a little bit easier. So that my gosh, did that accelerate my understanding of like literally every metric on the map, which there's, more than 150 right now on counter movement jumps alone. But you gain a much, much deeper understanding. Excuse me, but I've lost my train of thought. Where were we at?
Impact versus deceleration landing.
Impact and deceleration landings. So again, stiffness is Newton meters, right? So it's like, so you can produce, the highest possible Newtons at over the most distance, and relative to what your highest stiffness levels will not be very much, but relative to the joint position that you're looking at and to the task specific considerations, that's actually very high stiffness, right? So, that's basically what you're looking at is like, can someone differentiate that? And the way that I've analogized it is a deceleration landing. I would say it's like a commercial jet landing on this long pronounced runway, just like taking it in nice and smooth, don't disturb the passengers, where
Mm-hmm.
the stiffness landing, the impact landing, is more like a jet landing on an aircraft carrier, right? Where it's like you've got this super short runway, you don't even have enough room to stop, so you need like some assistance. Like that's pretty much what you're looking at, is trying to find how to push that to the limit, while providing a curve that makes it accessible, right? Like it's not like a boxer practicing getting punched in the face. We're not like trying to reproduce positions that would cause injury, but trying to teach them
Right.
competency and like how, okay, can you produce a hard stop with, a knee that's slightly flexed, right? And then, can we vary that across, the angles necessary for your sport and task?
Yeah, I agree. Shelby said likes that. I like that differentiation, deceleration versus the impact. I think that's a really good coaching cue that will I'll probably steal from you because it's
Yeah,
easier to explain. I
I'll,
like
I'll
your
tell you.
analogy too.
Yeah, the to take that one further briefly, just because I shouldn't have left this part out because it's what I always tell people. As I always tell people, jumping athletes generally don't land; they fall. And if the ground wasn't there, they just keep on falling. Like so, it's like the only reason you stop just because you hit something. It's like that's not if you're driving, that's not driving. You're hitting people. If you're
Right.
playing a sport, like no, you're not. That's not the most athletic thing that you could do. And so figuring out how to make that real for them. Uh, I don't know. Like, I think one of the big lessons for me early on was seeing that when we started trying to test these different conditions, and I had been training people in more of the deceleration style for so long, and then I wanted them to land tall and just to test like the impact forces, like on the force plate specifically.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them were resistant to it. Like you could see they didn't know how to not decel. Like they just knew
Mm-hmm.
how to bend and fold, but they had no idea how to just hit the plates. Where if you take someone who's uncoached, what you're going to get is they're just going to hit the plates. It's just going to be like how,
Yeah.
like so that was something that told me that it could become more innate where they don't even realize that they're producing a deceleration. And I think that that's actually probably a good thing, provided they've also had exposures to, I don't know if you would call it technical tactical, because that's fairly well neglected in sports, especially in volleyball. When you were talking about maximum intent on vertical jumps before, you were talking about that and how important it is. I was testing a volleyball team for a local club, pretty good group of athletes, 17-year age division, and and this is like mid-season testing, right? So I'm testing the team, and the coach is watching us test. He's like, you're not jumping as high as you can." And I pull him aside. I'm like, "Well, number one, this is testing environment." I'm like, "So coaching right now, I'm like, if you want to, sure, but I was like, but are you telling me that this is the first time we're talking about jumping as high as you can in volleyball? Because that would strike me as being a problem if you're just now realizing that they don't know how to jump as high as they can."
Yeah, yeah, it seems like something that may have been covered somewhere in the past. We're gonna open up. I mean, we'll keep the conversation going, but we were getting some questions in the chat. We'll open things up there as anything that's come up to date. Feel free to pop it in there, and then also, if you have questions as we go along, pop them in there. If you feel that your question's longer, you can either raise your hand or just say it in there that you wanted to chat, and I'll call you up there. But Quinn, who is our resident person who doesn't let his feet come off the ground except briefly in the snatch and the clean and jerk, which you have a history with. He asked a question here. He said, weightlifter bias here. Have you looked at much during the lifts with similar kinematic profiles as the kind of movement jump, like push presses and jerks? If so, any general insights there? And then leads into the second question, which is unrelated. Thinking about Goodhart's law, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Have you had to wrestle with the balance of optimizing the test performance versus just observing changes over time that we hope are coming from training intervention? So we'll start with the
Yep.
force profiles.
Yeah, it's really interesting on that because there aren't a lot of the weightlifting movements, right? You're basically talking about, you could maybe relate some of the high hang position, but even that one's not going to be a very clean, like eccentric kind of transition. But push presses and jerks for sure. I was actually just involved in some dialogue with Tracy Fober. I'm not sure if you guys know the name. She's a tremendous practitioner, roots to like Vern Gambetta and USA weightlifting and all kinds of great stuff. And she was talking about just from a development standpoint, how fond she is of power jerk and the characteristics and, what is it that we see, right? Because a lot of them will produce a negative rate of force development slope. And that's, a lot of people don't get like how that is, but it goes back to the reasons we were talking about with jumping. Talking specifically to push presses and jerks. Yeah. So the people who it's an interesting thing because that like take the slack out characteristic that we're talking about specific to jumps and how somebody represents that on a push press or jerk from a stiffness standpoint, right? You're really looking for someone like, gosh, I'd have a hard time describing it. Like, and I think that's, people have generally a pretty difficult time coaching jerks. Like jerks can be the most frustrating lift from a technical standpoint, like to perform and to coach. but also like some of the most empowering, right? Like when you get your timing and your jerk down, gosh, it's one of the, it's, you just feel rock solid. But when your timing is a little bit off, which happens normally about mid training cycle, then you're a disaster. But yeah, so that one, how people represent the stiffness characteristic there is actually probably, I would say, the most important consideration, because the degree of displacement that occurs has such room for more variance, right? Like if somebody is a more dynamic lifter, we know they don't have to get that bar actually going up as high. So the need for big accelerations from that position is yes, you have to accelerate the bar, but that part is, I would say, secondary to like just how they manage the condition of stability, right? Which in this case, I'll use stability and stiffness interchangeably. I realize it's inappropriate, but it's one of the ways that I'll coach it. Is just saying like, like you want to maintain a high degree of stability. That's what gives you like that box that you want to work from with your jerk footwork or with your push presses, is like owning that space. Uh, and then that's going to allow you to put as much energy into the bar as possible. It's and doing that while not inhibiting, right? By not looking too stiff and out of rhythm is also equally. That's where you see like the Chinese. I always loved watching them do like their jerk dips, where they're like, I mean, they have ridiculous amounts of weights on the bar, and them not even attempting the jerk, just going through that and thinking like that had a highly specific component in their training.
Hmm. And then Goodhart's law.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So because, let's say jumping, because obviously that's one of the things that I'm very passionate about. Let's just say specific to jumping. I would say that early on, I felt like I tried to be really sensitive to it, but over time it became, because jumping and how somebody learns to manage the stretch shortening cycle in a dynamic task like that relates so well across athletic development, that because it's so central, I felt like I could care less like if I'm training the test, if it was something where, like for instance, not every athlete's a jumping athlete. And if I'm trying to counter movement jump test them because that's what's in my wheelhouse, like that's the point where I feel like I'm overfitting, right? Like our women's soccer team, for instance, is a great example, is that I would say that we don't spend a whole lot of time on jumps with them. But if we think about where jumps are impactful in match conditions, gosh, they better be good jumpers, but how that
Mm-hmm.
emerges from the framework, I would say, is in our case is more organic, right? Like we're not training lots of jumps. Like I said, like it's one piece of the puzzle for us. Um, but again, a super important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the more the test is anchored to or sort of maps to the underlying characteristic of force production as a just biomotor ability or whatever term you want to use, the less I care about training to the test, because you either do it or you don't.
Yep.
It's like training to your max bench. If you're a power lifter, I don't care. That's it, right? Either you can do it or you can't. And
Right.
then the issue for me becomes my like you said, overfitting the idea that this matters for the thing that I care about. So if I want them to get stronger, I don't mind training to the test, but I better be sure that getting stronger is what matters. Because a lot of times we just see what we want to see.
Yep. Yeah. No, I
Uh,
agree with that.
Daniel asks, he says he has some experience working with dancers who have fairly unique requirements from a jump technique standpoint, such as jumping in a position with both hips at almost maximal external rotation. Do you recommend the counter movement jump test as the basis to evaluate jumping ability, or do you think a different test may be more appropriate? I'm assuming in that population.
Yeah, no, I sometimes I think what you'll get is like we see this a lot with hockey, where hockey will want to get tests that are super specific, right? And we got where they would mess with like the force time curve was just it didn't match up right because of what they were looking for. And then especially when you're talking about, because the force plate technology that we're talking about, so everybody's clear on, is vertical force only, right? Like it's not
Right.
like there are 3D force plates, but that becomes significantly more complex. And in terms of impact, it's not as impactful for most of the stuff that we're talking about right now. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's not important, because it absolutely is. It just means that it increases the amount of data that you have to process, like by a significant degree. So,
Yes.
but most of the time, what you'll see is that, and not having worked with dancers, I wouldn't presume to tell you that I would just CMJ test you. I would just tell you what you could expect from the CMJ, right? And which I would say is, if you have an athletic development piece to the training of dancers, and that involves performance in the weight room, then I would say that CMJs relate pretty well to the tasks that you're going to expose them to in a weight training environment, right? Especially if you're looking for something that's not testing maximum strength lifts, which may or may not be something that you do. Again, that's I'd say that's up to the practitioner. I would encourage you to look at the difference in those positions specific to those tests. That'd probably be the first thing that I would do, is just to see, like, is this purely a technical consideration, or is there some performance benefit that's, like, maybe specific to the development model in place, but that's how they've learned how to jump. It's kind of like talking weightlifters and bilateral stance as the dominant stance, being someone who spent a lot of time with weightlifting, and then moving into unilateral stance and single leg strength. Like, I've always had good position, so I can, pistol squat and do things like that. But in terms of, my split squat control and pelvic position, like, gosh, that's something that's really finicky. And I think, of course, that relates to, like, your pelvis is one bone, so it's like, if one side's sitting one way or the other side, it's not sitting exactly the same way, like, so some of that lack of harmony in unilateral stances, I think, can be really impacted. It's one of the reasons why you can do a single leg counter movement jump test, although I'm pretty critical, again, for all the reasons I've discussed so far, of, like, what that can actually turn into if your population is not moderately to well trained.
Right. Um, do you ever look at something like the dynamic strength index?
Yeah, so I mentioned the hex bar deadlift relationship before. That's become our kind of, like, our working model of the dynamic strength index. But we've done it. I would say that most of the athletes in our setting don't have the maximum strength to warrant, like, we'll get a lot of 2.5 to 3.5 times their body weight on the isometric mid thigh pull, which,
Mm-hmm.
again, when you relate to their vertical jump performance, it's like, wow, that's not very pronounced. That's not very strong. It's like, no, it's not. It's like, but to be strong in those positions, you either have to overload those specific positions, which could be, that could be an element of your periodization model, or you have to have a lot of time put in to maximum strength work over many years to truly be able to express that, right? Like, and so I would say that we're more likely to relate it to something like hex bar deadlift performance, back squat performance, and then just look at, can they produce similar forces in the vertical jump on the CMJ test.
And you're looking at that eccentric peak
Yep. And
again. Okay.
yep.
Gotcha. And then you're calculating that in Newton so that you don't confuse your.
Right. Right.
Shelby says, have you ever looked at EAC in healthy athletes? If so, any notable asymmetries limb to limb we should be aware of that exists in healthy populations?
Um,
And I'm not quite sure. Shelby, what do you mean by EAC?
So like energy absorption between like hip and the ankle
mm,
when we look at like dominant versus non-dominant limb. Because we look at
yeah.
our rehab athletes, and if there's like a big difference, it's something that we're aware of, but I just don't know how much that exists in healthy athletes.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually a really fascinating thing, because I think that what you'll see is and I'll just I'm gonna generalize a little bit here. It's actually remarkable to me just how symmetrical the force time curve will be in an athlete who's healthy.
Mm.
Like, and even athletes who don't look particularly good, they look kind of like a mess, but you're just like, wow, it's like your forces all, like, kind of they're pretty harmonious here, you know. And when you relate that to injured athletes, no, it's not. It's not close to being the same thing. But and again, one of the reasons why I like looking at a CMJ to a single leg CMJ, if you've got some training history with them, because I think that's what, you know, Scott and I are relating from our experiences, is that without that training history, you're shooting blind because you may not really be exposing some of those real differences yet. Um, but if you do have the ability to do a CMJ and then look at what the asymmetry is and then do a single leg CMJ, that's actually probably the most impactful thing that you could do. And you'd be able to further reveal some of those discrepancies from limb to limb in a healthy athlete. You know, like we've actually seen a lot of that. And it's, you know, like, where like sometimes the healthy athlete injures the stronger leg because they're doing it too much, and sometimes they hurt the weak leg because that one's not doing enough, you know. So it's
Yeah. We had Corey on recently, and he was talking about some of the single versus double, which reminds me, not really in line with any of this, but as far as I know, you're the only person to have published a paper on squatting to a max every day. Looking back on that,
still number one.
would you do it again? Yeah, still number one. Would you do that again?
I don't think I back squat for, actually, really, I don't back squat anymore. And from having weightlifted for a long time and not having the frame for it, I had like a cyst in my neck that actually, like, I guess it ruptured at some point. And that was excruciating. And now if I even just with an empty bar, if I do like demos, like my neck will stiffen up. And so after doing that, and I don't think that did it. Although you ask any weightlifter, like, of course it wasn't the weightlifting, but I was actually like, I think I was a little bit skeptical going into that project. And everybody I think was skeptical. All the friends that I talked with about it, they all thought I was going to get hurt. And I was just curious. Like I had finished my weightlifting career, which if you've never had to refer to yourself as a sub-elite Olympic weightlifter in a scientific paper, then that was a pleasure to have to write about myself. But anyway, sub-elite lifting. And so I was like, okay, I want to see what I can do with my squat. There's this squatting every day thing that, you know, is becoming a thing in weightlifting and strength and conditioning circles. This is before what, Squattober or all that. We were the originals, but it was a really interesting piece. Dan Baker was, who was at the time was the president of the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association, was the person who encouraged me to use the data and to write a paper on it. And so that sparked it for me. And then, yeah, it ended up being published. To my knowledge, it's the only thing in the scientific literature on squatting every day and a 1 rep max. And we managed to link all kinds of, Corey was my co-author on that. And we managed to link, you know, there's a couple of Russian weightlifting papers on there that are predominantly speaking to training frequency, right? Like the Bulgarian system and Russian systems of, you know, like how many training sessions they're putting in each week. Fully Russian articles also, by the way, if you pay attention to that detail, like that was not an easy trick to track those articles down. It was through the Stark Center in Austin.
Okay.
Anyway, but no, I'll never do that sort of thing again to myself. I would never ask anybody else to do that either.
Yeah, kind of like German volume training or any of the other things that. Any other questions? We're coming up to the top of the hour here. But Trevor Shelby, when you were back at THSM, we looked at a lot of healthy subjects, and there were some differences, non-dominant versus dominant limb. I'm sure Shibo may have some of that data. Perfect. Any other thoughts, questions, ideas? Sweet. Thanks so much for coming on. We could do this for hours, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and always learn a lot chatting with you. And I think this will be a solid resource, definitely. So what we do is we upload these then to the Academy, and it's available for anyone with sports physical therapy interests. And then we have a group who make a infographic about it, and we'll send you that to make sure you'll go over it and make sure that what they think you said is what you intended to say. And then we put that out publicly. But yeah, thanks, man. Good to catch up again.
Yeah, same. Thanks for having me on. If anybody has any follow-up questions or anything, I'm a open book, so feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to be of any assistance.
Sweet.